right, hello and welcome. My name is Jordan Selleck. I am the CEO and co-founder of 51 Labs, a marketing agency that is focused on the M&A and VC communities. Today, we're going to be talking about virtual AGM best practices. We've had a fair amount in the market, including two of the panelists today. And I think there's a lot of things that we can take out from this on things that we have done well, things to improve for the ones that are the rest of the year, as well as coming up next year. The first introduction I have is Dana John. Dana Johns, she's a senior portfolio manager for the Maryland State Retirement and Pension System. Dana, would you mind kind of giving a high level about what you do?
Sure. It's great to be here, Jordan. I love talking and sharing, kind of best practices around, things like annual meetings. But I am a senior portfolio manager at the State of Maryland Retirement System. We have a $58 billion plan, and our private equity portfolio is about 15% of the plan. That translates to about 60 GP relationships, over 100 partnerships, investment partnerships, and it's a global portfolio. So we have managers in North America, Europe, and Asia. And pre-COVID, I was traveling to a lot of annual meetings on the West Coast, in London, in Hong Kong. Last year I would have been this year, same time last year I was in Hong Kong. So it's definitely a much different year, and our transition to video, platform to do almost entirely all of our work, whether it's due diligence and, our topic here, attending annual meetings. So I look forward to participating, in the conversation. And we have a bunch of great panelists who can share their experiences too.
Awesome. We're going to move on to Christen because I think Jill is having some technical difficulties with Zoom. So Christen is the head of business development and investor relations for MiddleGround Capital. We've worked with them for the past 2 years, including most recently with video for their AGM. Christen, can you kind of give the high level of MiddleGround and your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jordan. So as Jordan mentioned, I'm the head of our business development and investor relations platforms here at MiddleGround Capital. We're a lower middle market buyout focused firm on the industrials sector predominantly. So B2B manufacturing and specialty distribution businesses. We raised our first fund last August. We're a $460 million first time fund. So this was our first real AGM, and we were really hoping to be able to do it in person, especially because one of the unique things about us is we're headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky. So, it's pretty fun to be able to gather people around, and do some horse betting at Keeneland and, taste some bourbon, do some events around obviously the important information that we relay at our AGM, but this year we went all virtual. So, it's obviously not the plan that we wanted, but, we ended up making it work, and, we got really good feedback from our LPs. So I think in the end, it was a successful event, even though it took a completely different form. So certainly happy to be part of this discussion today and share some of the lessons learned along the way.
Awesome. Looking forward to getting into that. Julia, would love to hear your background. She's a director of communications and investor relations at EIV Capital. Love to hear a little bit more about you, and then we will round up with Jill, who I believe just dialed in. So we should be good. Awesome.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jordan, for having me, inviting me on this panel. As Jordan mentioned, I'm the director of communications and investor relations for EIV Capital. EIV is a private equity firm based in Houston, and we specialize in the energy industry, specifically focusing on midstream opportunities and other opportunistic investments such as niche renewables. I've been working in some capacity with Patty Melcher, Jenny Gottschalk, and David Fine and the partners there since Fund 2, so since 2014, as well as on Fund 3, and then formally started with EIV as heading up their IR services a couple years ago. So obviously the AGM is a very large part of what I contribute to the firm. And this is the first time we went virtual as well. So it was great to actually have 51 Labs on the team with us to help us steer us forward.
Awesome, thank you. Next, Jill Kitazaki is president of Denning & Company, and she is dialing in. Jill, can you give a little background on Denning and also maybe some insight on how many virtual AGMs you have seen and kind of worked with through your clients?
As Jordan says, I'm president of Denning & Company, which is a boutique private markets advisory and fund placement firm in San Francisco. And I guess, you know, I'll answer the question on how many AGMs we've done, but we're boutique in every sense of the word. We work with 2 or 3 GP clients at any given time, and we tend to represent the same GPs over multiple fundraising efforts. So we become part of their, you know, really part of the fabric of the firm. And, you know, we try and work with our clients during the off season when we think we can be more effective in our fundraising. And we also invest our own personal capital after tax dollars in the funds that we raise. So we do attend the AGMs as investors alongside the LPs that we bring into the fund. So I think we've done about 10 client AGMs over the spring season and into fall. And I'm happy to give you my thoughts on all of those.
You know, what we'll be working through today is discussing the structure of the AGMs, including how long they were, how the Q&A sessions were managed, the locations, were people in multiple locations, how that was managed, who hosts it, do you have co-hosts to kind of manage the virtual dynamic, how do you handle registration, how do you do dry runs, how many dry runs should you do, how do you manage this balance between live and pre-recorded? And then also looking forward, what does 2021 look like now that the industry has really had their kind of first rep of doing virtually? You know, what does this mean next year on this balance? If we go back to work and we're in the office, is there going to be a virtual component? You know, Christen, I thought it might be interesting to kick off and kind of walk through the timeline that the MiddleGround team went through, how many weeks ahead of time, and what was like kind of the high level structure maybe to start with, how many hours, and what was the agenda going through? And then maybe we could actually go back to reverse engineering the timeline.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you know, this is obviously the Super Bowl of events that we put on throughout the year. And so the preparation, you know, sort of started 3 or so months beforehand. We have a pretty manageable LP base. As mentioned, we have 1 fund. We currently have 6 platforms. So, you know, we were kind of starting in earnest, I guess, you know, this summer, and then sort of, you know, as we realized we were not going to be doing a mix of on-site and kind of virtual, we ended up kind of going down the path of, you know, how do we kind of select the right technology? How are we going to host this thing? So we actually had a couple of fits and starts on that front. At one point, we were going to work with a production studio, you know, has a base in broadcasting. We had done another event earlier this summer that way, another conference that we held with our CEOs and CFOs. There were some hiccups and some pluses and minuses of using that third-party group, and, you know, and making sure the content was very easily consumed. So, you know, we went down that path. We spoke with a few other groups, and then ultimately decided to use Zoom webinar. So once we kind of settled in on the technology, which was something that we kind of wrestled with, you know, over the course of that 3-month period. But we knew we wanted to be able to shoot from, you know, 2 locations. As mentioned, we're headquartered in Lexington. We have an office in New York, which is where I'm speaking to you from today. And we wanted to involve a lot of our team. So we knew that we were going to be shooting from those 2 locations. We knew that, you know, I think that we're planning on, you know, for as far as our agenda went, we knew, you know, kind of the basics of what we wanted to cover, which would be, you know, just how much we've accomplished sort of in that year of raising our first fund, and give an update on the organization and the team build out and some of our key strategic initiatives, you know, an update on deployment, distributions, things that, you know, were probably updates that a lot of our LPs had already had, but just wanted to really, spell that out and crystallize it. And then some other kind of big picture, longer term, updates on, for example, our ESG initiative that we kicked off earlier this year. That was something that we know is important to a lot of LPs, but isn't always front and center in kind of the quarterly updates that we provide, or the quarterly conversations that we have with our investors. We also wanted to provide some commentary on the macro environment. Obviously, a lot's happened in 2020, and that's affected different industries in different ways. So we wanted to give our perspective on how that had impacted, the industrials landscape, and what we were kind of, thinking about over the course of this, weird year that we've all been experiencing. And then kind of the more standard updates around, the different portfolio companies that we own, our investment theses there and how they've played out. And then kind of talking, thinking forward about, business development, some of the deal flow, market commentary that we could share based on, our experience sourcing deals in this environment. Some of those deals that are in advanced stages. We do co-invest with our LPs, so kind of mentioning some of those opportunities to get involved on a co-invest level, and then kind of closing it out, kind of with some forward-looking initiatives for 2021. And that took about 3 hours, all virtual. And I'm sure we'll get into this later in the conversation, but we really did block that out kind of minute by minute to make sure that we were utilizing the 3 hours appropriately and not running over on time.
That's good. Can you talk about the format of it? Was on one side you had the presentation, on the other side you had it live, and it was interesting to see that, because beforehand I thought that pre-recorded was like the only way, because it allows you to work out the technical difficulties, stuttering or reading the screen incorrectly. But it was interesting, the feedback that you got afterwards from attendees. Can you kind of talk about that? And before that, one quick note, one of the things I really liked about the presentation is that the font was big. A few words, the font was big, great graphics. It looked really slick, which I think was great for a virtual format, as opposed to like when I did banking for 6 years and you're making a sim. And so I think that was really interesting on one of the things that you did for the virtual environment. But I'd love to hear the feedback you got on that live reading of fund portfolio company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think part of it, right, is just holding people's attention. And so we were pretty committed to doing a live event all along. It wasn't really a question of whether we were going to do pre-recorded. That came with its whole own bag of stresses, because producing a live event is obviously challenging, and there's a lot more opportunity for things to go wrong. So that part was stressful, and almost, I think we were talking to you guys like up until the last moment of just making sure we could iron everything out. But we thought it was really important to be able to do that, and I think it just kind of mixed things up for the audience. And the feedback we got was that it just felt more engaging. It was good to really be able to see more of the team, since we had so many team members across the investment team and operating team participate. And what we did to sort of facilitate that was, rather than have sort of, we used, as mentioned, Zoom webinar, we had 2 podiums set up at our offices. So we didn't have people kind of coming in from their own office setup or their own home office setup. It looked, I think, a little bit more polished and professional overall. Yeah. So I think that was one of the things that helped. We had kind of people move in and out of those frames, and it made the management of, who was spotlit at any given time a little bit easier to facilitate. Yeah. And then to your point about the presentation, I mean, yeah, you should have seen our slides before we sent them off to our content manager who helps us with all the aesthetics of our deck, because they were loaded up. But that was feedback that we had gotten early on in the process, and talking to different third parties we were planning on using or discussing our project with, to just make make, the slides pop a little bit more and have less on the page and have the team members really speak to the slides more than have the slide convey, a ton of information that was just going to be overwhelming.
Yeah, I think
that was
a
feedback.
couple of technical notes that I noticed is that one, I really liked the live dynamic of it. You could feel the energy. It was more engaging for that time that I blocked off, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to look at email and I'm going to look at something else. So it was really engaging. I also, some technical notes that I think are interesting to consider are, if you are in an office, having maybe some like towel dampeners because of people walking around, they might have heels, or someone closing a door. So those technical aspects. And then also like your lighting was really good in both offices. You could tell the production quality. The background for your Kentucky office was awesome. It was very, very well polished. On little things to also coordinate are things like shirts and little details like that. Like, are you wearing a white shirt? Are you wearing a blue shirt? Because people might start sweating underneath the lights. And I think one of the key takeaways from that is practice, practice, practice. If you're going to do live, that's a trade-off, cool, but practice. You got to do it 5 times, because Julia, with EIV, one of the things that we ran into like the day before, I think it was like the morning before, even the morning of, the speaker went out, but we had to fix out like the length of the cable. But I think what happened, because we did 5 dry runs, we knew, okay, let's chill out. We got this. We got everything else covered. This is minor. We'll get through this. But maybe that's a good transition over to you to kind of hear, the high level structure, length, and general.
Sure.
And what you think worked and what you think didn't work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In general, Jordan, I think the enemy of a good plan is the dream of a perfect plan. So because this was our first time out and we were working on a really shortened time period, I think by the time that you and I and Cole and Charlie and the team got up and running, we had effectively 3.5 weeks. And so in terms of structure, we made it as simple as possible. We decided to go ahead and leave the macro section out and shoot that separately and send that to our LP base after the fact. It was important, but I think what we wanted to focus on is having a 2-hour AGM that toggled between recorded portions of video that were very polished and then live Q&A directly after we discussed the portfolio company. So we started at the top with a basic introduction and started off with Fund 4, which we're still in the market with currently. And then we went backwards into Fund 3 and Fund 2. And at the end of every single portfolio company, we decided to switch over to a live Q&A in order to engage our audience. And that seemed to be really effective. And we kept it to 2 hours, and we did the same thing where we were looking at it minute by minute, and it was about practice, right? As we had about 4 weeks or so to work with, we decided to do dry runs every single week to work out all the kinks. And as you mentioned, one of my best practices is practice, practice, practice. And so we incorporated multiple dry runs every single week. In fact, we had 4 on calendar, and we realized when something else cropped up that we needed a 5th. It's important to make the time to find and fix these mistakes, and that overall decreases our stress level, increases the production value. Likewise, the flip side of having multiple dry runs is you want to make sure to be super thoughtful on who you invite to them. So, and specifically speaking, you need to be thoughtful and protective of your partner time. So when we're doing the dry runs in the very beginning, where we're just talking through tech and lighting, et cetera, and sound quality, we want to bring in, the IT professionals. We had administrators come in. We pulled in kind of the best people on our team in order to help polish that up as much as possible. And again, making sure that the partners were in the dry runs where they were actually focused on the technical aspects of going live, Q&A, and then switching back and forth.
Yeah, I think that's a couple of notes here. One is having partner involvement at the very beginning to get the sign off on the agenda also, with MiddleGround, we noticed like we had kind of like the working group, but then when we circulated to the larger team, we had feedback on like the scripts for the video or how things were flowing. And so I think that was really interesting to have that balance, being aware of that balance of when to manage the working group with the larger deciding group. And then the other thing that we did with you all, I think, which was really good. I'm glad we went through this process. I think we did like 50 what if scenarios. Like, what if the camera in your conference room doesn't turn around? What's the backup plan? Oh, you have you have your desktop, you have a laptop on the conference room table. Well, whose laptop? Who's going to be logged in? What's that process? What's the fail safe? And then while we're thinking about on the structure of yours, I thought, to kind of help set some context, we directed this from New Jersey and they were in Texas.
Correct.
And so we would do everything, like they would walk around the office with the camera over Zoom to say, here's the conference room. Let's use this one, not the other room. Oh, actually, you know what? We need to shoot in the lobby because it had a better backdrop. But I think that was interesting on also getting the equipment list. If you're going to shoot it, if you have a tighter budget, or if you want to have some of it, shot with your own equipment, get that equipment list and then walk through the scripts. I think we did like 2 or 3 shoots for each partner to give their piece of the fund or the Portco overview.
Right, testing the scripts during our shooting day and then reshooting as necessary and involving the compliance officer as needed was a really key point in making sure that those videos were polished and that we weren't saying anything we weren't allowed to.
Yeah, Christen, over to
at the same time. Sorry, I just want to one other point, and to your one of your strengths, Jordan, is your ability to coach people and identifying and tackling individual coaching needs for each presenter. They were all very different. In real time as we were shooting was really key.
Yeah, and that brings up another point about teleprompters, and I think this also applies to Christen when the team was reading. There are apps for your phone like Nano Teleprompter, and you could literally, the quality is so good on your phone. You can read from that, so the video is great, and you have the teleprompter and you're looking straight into it as opposed to over here or down here. And so there are one of the things that we did with EIV was we have an open Google Doc and we would just scroll it as they were reading the script. And then Christen, we also did that with the local team when we were doing the scripts for the AGM videos. I honestly didn't know how that was going to turn out with the virtual directing and us just being present. Let's hear your thought. Like, what did you like? What did you think could be better? And then Dana and Jill would love to hear your thoughts around, details such as macro sections. Do you include video about Portcos, pre-recorded? But Christen, I'd love to hear your thoughts before we turn it over to Dana and Jill.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, you're exactly right on a lot of the pre-recorded videos that we did that were, 2.5 minute sort of overviews of each of our portfolio companies that incorporated some of our operating team, which are often, kind of behind the scenes type, they don't get as much spotlight maybe as some of the investment team members. So it's great to be able to showcase them as well as some of the management team members at our portfolio companies themselves, and then actually just show what an industrials company does. It's great to talk about CNC machining and centerless grinding, but I think the average audience member probably doesn't know what that looks like or what that entails. So actually being able to show it is really helpful in the case of what we invest in. And so I think, what was great, the operators had a large task of, being able to explain what the companies do and, what our investment thesis was. But, that requires, some voiceover, some of being on the shop floor. And so being able to shoot something with a teleprompter was really helpful, especially, for those segments where they were kind of talking in depth about a certain process or you know, a certain component that's getting manufactured and how that works, or certain machinery. So, you know, it was really helpful to be able to have that there. And I think we didn't leverage it for the live event, but it's something that I would absolutely consider, just seeing how well, you know, I think the finished product on the produced videos turned out.
So for some context, there were 6 portfolio company videos across 6 states shot and virtually directed in 30 days, plus a CEO panel. And then we helped out a little bit for the ESG in New York. The thing that I think made it work within that timeline is that you provided the script you wanted to tell, so that we could direct in Texas, Wisconsin, you know, Illinois, et cetera. So we could direct and prep the videographer, prep the management, prep the operators. Like, here are talking points. Here's our equipment list. Let's prep for this. We had to do a reshoot in Texas. But the other thing I thought was really, really interesting, which I want to open the floor for, is your CEO panel. The feedback was good on that. But I'm curious, like, what does everyone think about doing that live versus pre-recorded? I think the pre-recorded turned out perfectly fine, but what is that added dynamic which you also experienced when you were talking about the fun? So I'd love to hear your thoughts, then Dana and Jill, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, we got great feedback on our CEO panel, because it was a great way to, and we pre-shot that, so that was not part of the live production. And it was a great way, and that was somewhat scripted as well. You know, we had certain questions we wanted to cover, we had certain things we wanted to bring to the forefront, and we used it as a way to sort of showcase the way we partner with our companies, because that's something that we can talk about, but it's always great, I think, to hear it directly from the management teams, especially in a year like this, where there's just a lot of challenges that they faced beyond the normal course of operating a business, just sort of in crisis mode. And you know, which kind of tools that we were able to provide, or you know, what kind of guidance we were able to give that was particularly useful. And it was really interesting to sort of have the panel all showing, like in a Brady Bunch fashion, with one of the partners moderating that discussion, and being able to hear kind of directly the challenges that some of them faced, and you know, how we were able to help them through that. So it was, I think, about an 8-minute segment, but one that we got really positive feedback on, because it's a look that a lot of people don't normally get to see. And
we shot that whole thing over Zoom, so it was easier to do, but then putting the production value on top of it. So you can do it remotely with your management teams. And to your point about, like, how do you connect the team, like not just the firm, but also with the portfolio companies? It's a great way to show team cohesion. Dana and Jill, love to hear your thoughts on, kind of, after you've listened to Julia and Kristen, your thoughts around maybe even like a flash round. How long have you seen work? Things that you've liked and not liked about the structure and content. And we'll just kind of start there.
I just want to, this is Jill, just really quick, Dana. I just want to say, Kristen, can I come to your annual meeting next year? That sounds like it is such a fun annual meeting. So please put me on your list if possible. And then I'll settle for virtual too.
No problem.
Sorry, Dana, go ahead.
No, I'll start it off, and then Jill, you tag team with me, because I probably have done, you know, pre-COVID in person, I would have maybe done 5 to 6 annual meetings in each season. So the whole time around 10. I think from March until now, I mean, I've done over 14 or 15 annual meetings, just given that when they're scheduled, you know, I can participate in almost all of them, because I don't have to travel to either a different country or another part of the, West Coast versus East Coast. So, so I've seen a lot, and I have to say, over, you know, kind of the arc from March, I think my first annual meeting, and I feel really bad for them, was in April, and they went for it. And I have to say, that was the annual meeting that was 7 hours long. and was only presentation, and you just could hear a voice. You did not see the you know, kind of the Zoom, the Zoom, you know, use of Zoom had not kind of gotten, you know, everyone on board with it and feeling comfortable. Clearly, I could understand. I mean, I have so much appreciation for what I just heard about the, you know, production of putting together an annual meeting. I mean, clearly I'm attending it as a participant, and I would have to say, I mean, everyone's like come up on the learning curve in terms of using these platforms, but I think the professionalism, the quality, you know, the content has been exceptional. And I think that these platforms have given, I think, either, you know, GPs the ability to add more content than they might actually be able to pack in live. So I've had GPs who have done multiple day, you know, kinds of annual meetings. And then I've had other, you know, managers who've done it 2 hours, and it's been, you know, perfect, you know, and totally scripted. And, you know, you've got the information you needed. I do think during COVID, we've had a lot of meetings with our GPs. So I do think that, you know, there was a repetition in the, you know, kind of what the messages that they were delivering. But it's always great. I mean, you know, in terms of content, portfolio updates, I love, you know, when CEOs are, you know, highlighted. It brings to life the portfolio companies and the portfolio. Sector deep dives, you know, I think, you know, kind of market updates, it's fine to do something recorded and then as, you know, kind of, you know, additional material to send to LPs who can, you know, kind of watch that at their leisure. But I do think that there is a Zoom fatigue, and having tightly, you know, kind of run annual meetings, there's so much competition with conferences and things like that now because everyone's online. So I do think, you know, there's a lot to be said for the kind of video platform, but I do think in person is not going to be replaced. I do think that LPs will attend in person, but I do think going forward with the paradigm shift that there will be a lot of this online that's, you know, for LPs, you know, very, you know, kind of convenient when we have a big portfolio to kind of manage.
And what do you think is the most creative thing you have seen a GP do?
Sure. Yeah. So early on, you know, kind of this was around May, no, it might have been early June. So everyone was more comfortable with using Zoom. We were all communicating together, team meetings, things like that. And this was a really great annual meeting. And one of the first things that they did at the very beginning, and I think that there's this personalization that we have not, the LPGP has not had before, because sometimes you're watching, you know, partners in their homes, you know, delivering from their dining room, you know, their message or whatever. But so I think there's a little bit, LPs have a little bit of forgiveness around that because it makes everyone more human. But it was a video of a talent show, you know, so everyone's trying to keep up morale, you know, the GP, you know, kind of was, you know, team morale. And so they did this, you know, everyone had to send in a Zoom video of, or video of a talent, you know, whether it was them or their kids. And then they put it together in this really cute 1 minute. I mean, it wasn't even super long. It was brilliant. It was just like, I was weeping. But I think back then our emotions too were, you know, kind of at pretty high, and anything that was, you know, kind of that you could connect with was great. But those kinds of, you know, personal touches, I think are fine. And, you know, because we are going to all go back to the, you know, in person, and it will be in a hotel or it will be, you know, wherever, it will be less personal. So those are some of my thoughts, you know, around the good and the bad and the ugly.
Jill, over to you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Dana. We had this discussion, earlier in the summer about virtual AGM best practices. And so I learned a lot from Dana in terms of what she was seeing in the early spring when people were, having to really learn for themselves on how to navigate virtual AGM environment. I think shorter is better, just cutting as much as you can to just what is the nitty gritty. And, I think 3 hours or less, if possible, would be great. Some people just have a lot more content or multiple funds across the LPs. So they do have to have, I'm hearing 5 hours, sometimes 8 hours. So Dana, those still exist.
Yeah.
And, for a friend who runs a large fund of funds in Asia, it was a week-long event, which kind of replicates, which one I'm talking about, which replicates. Yeah, and it's just because, you've got the funds and then the underlying portfolio companies. And so it just becomes this, it's crazy content. So, and I agree with Jordan in that you have to practice. And it sounds like Christen and Julia's AGMs were fantastic with that mix of live webinar and pre-recorded. Some of the AGMs that I've attended, the variability of the CEO presenter, it becomes really stark when you see them on camera, side by side. I think when you're in person, if someone's not grabbing your attention, it's easy to kind of, look down or look at your emails. When we're in this virtual environment, it is very clear who is a good presenter and who's not presenting well. I also think for companies that have consumer product or something that's tangible, having a pre-recorded video about the product is also really informative. I sat in on a virtual AGM where they have this AI robot that is so realistic, and the CEO went through a demonstration of how this robot reacts to voice-activated commands. And it was, you just were like, oh my gosh, this is a young version of HAL in terms of just how fluid this AI communication is. So I think that there's so many great things that we're gaining from a virtual environment that we're going to take forward. Like Dana says, the hardest for us is to try and figure out how to create sort of this team cohesion, to really demonstrate that to the LPs on screen when you're in boxes.
That's interesting. Can you talk about this idea of how do you include LPs? For the GPs, it's about kind of mitigating risk in the execution of this. Dana, you and I were talking about in the vlog, just as we were brainstorming, should GPs have almost like a small panel with the LPs when you can have discussions? Should it be like two? Because maybe they're asking questions others might have. There's obviously the risk for the GPs and like, oh God, I don't want to go through a question I don't know the answer to. But what is that? Can you talk about that idea we were chatting about? And if that is a good idea, if it's a bad idea, and obviously Christen and Julia, your thoughts on that?
I guess it depends on what the fund is, kind of who the fund is, their LP base. Sometimes you have a very global LP base. Sometimes you have more localized LP base. I do think, it's polling your LPs sometimes and saying, hey, would you want to have a breakout where you could, have kind of a small group with a partner. I do think kind of taking kind of a page out of what conferences have been doing, where they'll have breakouts, or other organizations that are kind of doing Zoom, where there is a breakout. If you can curate that in a way, I think that would be highly successful. And I would totally participate if I could, just it doesn't have to be super long. It could be 30 minutes or even, 15 minutes, and you can maybe like move it around. I know technologically or technology wise, that's probably very difficult, because you're moving people around, and we don't even see, like, the moderator who has to do all of that, you know, kind of movement of people. But I do think
Well, actually, that's bringing a really good point, which is, Julia, we noticed this with directing yours. It is at least a 2 or 3 person job.
Yeah.
And that's just if you have one location.
Yeah.
Because you have one person who's asking, for example, with EIV, you know, if people are asking questions, well, who's scanning the questions? Okay, let's answer that, or maybe that's a little bit afterwards.
Yeah.
So I think technically, or for your setup, you have to have multiple people on top of the 4 or 5 dry runs.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Sorry, Diane. Sorry, Dana. So yeah, I completely agree. What we ended up doing is we didn't want to over-engineer anything that we weren't, you know, this is a brave new world for all of us. And we had, again, a very shortened time period in order to figure everything up and get up the learning curve for Zoom. So we decided not to do breakout sessions. But what we did do and how we engage with LPs is made sure that we had the chat feature enabled. So we did the live Q&A, and with the chat feature, this allowed the team actually to really relax the day of event and focus on delivering articulate answers to important investor questions during the day of the event. So the feedback I received was the team seemed very relaxed and they were able to answer very thoughtfully, and that was very much appreciated by the LP base. The other piece of it is, I would say what we didn't do well, which we should have done better, is to make sure to pause during the live Q&A sessions and not just roll right into the next video. If there are no questions that come in at first, you know, have a team member type in a previously agreed upon question to start that conversation. Have the presenter answering the question announce that person who's asking the question, read it aloud, and then provide your answer. What we also got in terms of feedback is that it would be great to then focus that video on the presenter answering the question versus the entire group. That just kind of enhances the attendee experience, makes it much more personal. What we ended up doing is having 4 partners in a large conference room, acceptable, you know, socially distanced, following CDC guidelines, but then that entire screen basically made everybody's face about this big, and so then you don't get that kind of personal feeling. So that's something that I would change moving forward.
Interesting. So we have about 12 minutes left. I'd like to go through some of these questions, and then whoever wants to answer, feel free to jump in. First one is, can you talk about how you interacted with each other and LPs? Could LPs see each other? Did colleagues stay muted when not speaking? Christen, can you answer that? And then Dana and Jill, love to hear your thoughts, or one of you, if you can give that. And if just a quick time check, about 11 minutes left.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, within the beauty of Zoom webinar is that you know, the attendees can't see one another. And then you can also actually choose which of your panelists or hosts, if you're hosting in multiple locations, are kind of spotlit and are in view of the rest of the, you know, attendee list. So if we wanted to show both Kentucky and New York at the same time, we could do that. If we wanted to only show one, we could do that. If we wanted to, you know, jump between very seamlessly, we could easily do that by having, you know, multiple hosts kind of manage that process. In terms of the interaction with LPs, we did, I would say that was pretty much limited to Q&A in this virtual environment. I agree with Julia and with Dana about, you know, it'd be great to have a breakout session. We were not quite there on the technology piece yet to figure that out. I think that would be wonderful to do in the future if this, you know, persists. Because it's something that we would do in a live event. So it's how do we kind of recreate those pieces virtually. I have heard about, you know, some interesting ideas that have, you know, people have done on that front on the fundraising side, but I haven't heard of it kind of being mastered in time for an AGM meeting. So certainly something that we would explore, but unfortunately we're unable to do so in time for this meeting.
Jill?
You know, I think the webinar, this is just putting my fundraising hat on. If you're doing a webinar, and I was just on one last week, they are able to invite prospective investors. So, you know, everybody's fundraising. You're always fundraising. And so if they're LPs who are tracking you, the webinar environment really masks, the audience a bit. In past years, if we were in fundraising mode and we had an annual meeting that coincided, we would invite prospective investors, but all the existing investors knew who was in the room. And so this is a great way to really showcase the firm and do it in a way where, it's slightly anonymous. So I'm a big proponent of it.
That's a really, really good point, which kind of reminds me of, in terms of prospective investors, like this is a balance of one, education, but also entertainment. Like that's just reality. You're sitting in front of the screen for 2 to 4 hours and they have Zoom fatigue. It better be interesting and varied. So the structure of who's talking, one person or multiple people, do you have video? Do you not have video? How do you interact with them? Also the breaks. Should you have a break at 2 hours for 5 minutes? Or should you not? During the breaks, use your polling feature to engage them. Like, hey, how many AGMs have you attended this year? 5, 10, 15, and play music during those breaks. All of these little things add up to make it a quality experience so they will remember who you are, so that like the firm Dana mentioned, 6+ months later, you will remember the talent show. You will remember who that GP is. All of these details matter. So let's go on to the next question. And that is, and actually, I think this is an interesting question more structurally that Suzanne Stella is going to give me an idea about. Dana and Jill, have you seen a fundamental structural and content difference between buyouts versus VC? And I ask that because a VC firm had, for their third section, a guest speaker just to talk about an interesting topic that was relevant to their investment criteria. So I have not seen buyout firms do that, but I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are and what you've seen.
I actually on the buyout side, there have been like fireside chats. So I do think that, depending on how many funds there are that you need to cover, if you're a more mature fund and there's like 3 funds that you kind of have to review, there might not be that time. And that's where the pre-recorded kind of CEO insertions, maybe during the breaks or, wherever. But I do think that kind of smaller funds, if they are sector focused and, whether it's healthcare or tech, I think it's a nice touch to have, kind of a fireside chat, with a partner and, a leading kind of, voice in the industry, things like that.
And Jill, what have you seen on the kind of any fundamental differences in content or structure between buyout and VC?
Not really. I mean, the early stage venture teams are at sort of disadvantaged because some of their enterprise software, B2B technology is sort of hard to represent when it's early stage. You can only talk about what they're trying to accomplish. And so that is kind of dry content. I think the buyout teams have much more tangible, content that they can represent. And so I do think fireside chat or, a really interesting presentation like the ones that you did for the GPs is probably, just the difference that I've seen.
Okay. I'm going to go to one of the other questions here, which is for those who have added more formal LP meetings before the AGM as an outgrowth of the pandemic, how should the content of the potential AGM be handled given LPs are being informed more regularly? Open floor.
Good question.
I mean, I guess it depends on the timing of the annual meeting. Now we're at 9:30 numbers are starting to come out. If there's annual meetings and, kind of a little bit later in the year, I think there's a focus on that. There's, I think that kind of highlighting, if you have been updating, and I agree with you that we've had a lot of LP, kind of updates over from March through, now, but I do think it's this is an opportunity to perhaps highlight team members that you think are, kind of the next gen, and have them out in front of, this is a kind of safe way of having them out in front of the investors. I think, highlighting, just, I think that it is an opportunity to be able to highlight, but I'm focused on, what does the portfolio look like? Are there any kind of issues that we need to be? I think we've had so much transparency, we know what the issues are, but it's, kind of between March and now, there's been a lot of even change then where, companies that they thought were in the red zone are now in the green. And, like there's been this like massive, sometimes very quick transformation where they thought it was going to be, into 2021 kind of thing. So it's been a really interesting year. And
let's turn that over to 2021. Let's think of one thing for each person, for each panelist, one thing that you think will be different for your AGM, or the ones that you're attending, or Dana, that you want GPs to have. Name one thing for 2021 that you would like to do differently, or you think is going to be a trend. Starting off with Julia.
Okay, so to answer your question in a slightly different way, I would say be prepared for the game to completely change in 2021. And that to me means follow and identify new tech early. Identify what your peers are doing and what you may want to include. I know that some of our peers are actually recording content and distributing that a few days early so that investors have time and flexibility to watch their content and then follow up with a live Q&A session afterwards for that to be a little bit more meaningful. And most importantly, you have to poll your audience to make sure you know how your investors' expectations will likely be changing in the coming months. So I don't have a crystal ball, but I have a phone and I talk to my investors every day, and I ask these questions all the time.
Nice. Christen. And by the way, we've launched some polling because we have 3 minutes left, but I would love to get your feedback. Christen, your one prediction.
I mean, my hope is we can do some level of in-person again next year.
What?
We're thinking about, the same timeline next year. I mean, there's been some promising updates coming out. We don't know, but I think in the end, be prepared for a hybrid model. You definitely need to have the technology piece ironed out if you have to go all virtual. But I do think that, just like with all of the other aspects of our business model, people are going to be more flexible with how they engage with their, work environment, what travel policies will be like. And so some LPs may continue to prefer going virtual. So I think you need to have that offering going forward. And so you do need to be well-versed in how to manage that type of event.
Awesome.
I'll keep it quick so Jill can wrap it up, but I would just say breakouts. That's what I'd love to see. I think that we are going to continue into this virtual well into 2021. I don't know when I'm going to be able to travel, so I will be participating virtually and would hope to have that, kind of that option. And I'll leave it there. And Jill,
it's important to note that there is webinars versus Zoom meetings, and then making sure people go smoothly in between the two for those breakouts. All right, Jill, over to you to bring us home.
Sure. I'm actually going to borrow this one from Dana. So, when this first started, she said, this is a really great opportunity for GPs to level the playing field. So assuming that 2021, especially spring, will still be virtual, maybe fall will be in person and hybrid. We used to have these smaller funds that would compete with, these great outings in Scottsdale or, in Santa Barbara with really big budgets. And now when you're a smaller, GP, you can actually go toe to toe in terms of content quality and output, against some of these incredible platforms, these large platforms. So I think it's a real great opportunity for smaller AUM firms to really shine in their AGM environment.
That's awesome. All right. If you have any more thoughts or questions or ideas that you want to share, please feel free to email them. We're going to share this recording as well as a full article with kind of best practices and takeaways. And I would really like to thank Christen, Julia, Jill, Dana for your time. This has been great. Thanks so much.